We have about an hour together, and I'd like to spend the time spending the first few minutes making some remarks, but then really opening it up to a conversation with and among you. And my remarks draw from several sources. My current work with Kresge Foundation, my work with the NEA on the National Council. I teach in the Drucker School of Management at Claremont, so I work with people who aspire to be arts administrators. And then also from about 20 years of research on arts and culture in communities and work that I did at the Urban Institute. Much of my work has focused on integrating arts and culture into how we think of healthy places to live, places where people can thrive, how we think about it as part of what we measure when we say we measure what matters in communities. My background is in urban planning, with a particular focus on comprehensive strategies to address issues in mostly urban, low-income, often communities of color, but generally thinking about urban inequality, equity, and the kinds of strategies that begin to address those issues, and the role of the arts in all of that. I think for much of this meeting, appropriately, the conversation has been focused on evaluation and measuring how things happen on the ground. Appropriately, it's a super important place where we need to make strides. I'm going to ask us to think forward, though. And what I'd like to do is ask us to imagine 10, 15, 20 years from now, if part of what we seek to accomplish is not only success with projects on the ground in the places where we live and care about, but also we seek to create the conditions where creative placemaking is part of how people do business. It's part of, in the arts field, how we think of part of the arts field's work. It's part of how we think of good community development. And it's part of how we think of urban planning and comprehensive strategies from many different other policy sectors that seek to address issues in a synergistic way, that the integration of arts and culture is a dimension of all of that. So if that's part of the work now, and we think forward 10, 15, 20 years from now, what's different? What macro issues are different? And some of the work that we did in preparing to launch the national strategy at the Kresge Foundation, which is focused on creative placemaking, and we think about creative placemaking as the integration of arts and culture into comprehensive community revitalization strategies, and believe that that integration will lead to positive benefits in the cultural realm, in the social realm, in the economic realm. And that this will help to expand opportunities in communities that have been marginalized. So with that as a premise for some of the work, at least out of the foundation, in preparing the strategy, we thought a lot about what are some of the challenges that we have to deal with, not just from a foundation perspective, but as part of a field of people who care about this work. And the kinds of issues that came up are, not surprisingly, issues very similar to ones that I'd confronted in work that I did at the Urban Institute that had to do with integrating measures of arts and culture in how we think of quality of life. And there are some thoughts that I'd like to just put out there in terms of challenges or opportunities, because you can often turn a challenge into an opportunity. But I want to start by pointing out that we're in a particular point in time that we need to be mindful of. We're in a cycle where there is this revival of interest in comprehensive strategies at national and local levels. So we're in a moment where people recognize that The challenges of many communities are multiple and interrelated. You can't deal with housing without dealing with health. You can't deal with health without dealing with employment. You can't deal with employment without dealing with education. And these things are all connected. In this moment, there is an opportunity to reassert the role and value of arts and culture in how we think about both healthy places to live and the strategies required to improve communities. And I think that there have been important strides, certainly at the national level, with some of the work that the National Endowment for the Arts has done in the last few years, not only in advancing the idea of creative placemaking with the help of Ann and Ann, but also in the very difficult and I think passionate work that they've done around building relationships with other federal agencies. So as a result of some of the efforts of the National Endowment for the Arts, there are now relationships with Housing and Urban Development, with Department of Education, with the Department of Transportation, Health and Human Services, and even the Department of Defense. And there was some relationship even before, but these have certainly ratcheted up and are strengthened. And concrete examples of this are that with HUD, Housing and Urban Development, as part of the Choice Neighborhood initiatives, there's now some language in the request for proposals that actually encourages the inclusion of arts organizations as plausible partners in the work that will be proposed, so in the planning stage and also in the implementation stage. With the Department of Education, through the Promise neighborhoods, they've gone even a step further where there is what they call Option 6. And for those of you who have been involved in Promise neighborhoods, you may know Option 6 is what you can check off and to indicate that you are, in fact, having an arts and culture component in the Promise Neighborhood strategy, and you're adjudicated an extra point for having that. So there's a competitive advantage for being able to say that you're doing that. And those are certainly steps in the right direction. They're first steps. They're not perfect, but it signals an important, I think, inclination and opening that we need to be mindful of and take advantage of. So these are exciting signals, I think, in this potentially prolonged time where there is this focus on comprehensive strategies. Some important challenges remain, and this is what I want to see if we can address in conversation. One, despite with this progress, arts and culture still isn't on the radar for many people. And understanding of the role of arts and artists is fairly limited. So I often think about a continuum, right? So if on one hand, at the least desirable end, you have people who either dismiss the arts completely or have a very narrow interpretation of what the arts are, what artists do, and why it matters, and maybe a little bit moving progressively to this side, you think, okay, well, the arts are important because it makes for more pleasant places to live. So there's a beautification element, and it's nice to have as a recreational opportunity. Okay, that's moving a little further along. At this end, the most desirable end, I think one thinks of many different ways in which the arts are both manifest in communities or potentially manifest in communities, and the role of artists is much more robust. So we're thinking not only of artists as people who create things to be sold or bought or consumed, which is an important dimension of what artists do, but we also think about artists as having multiple relationships to publics, as people who help others who may not be artists reach in and dig into their own creativity, their own creative expression, and deliver that somehow. So there are these many and varied ways in which artists, and by extension arts organizations, can engage not only audiences or visitors, but people as communities and as stakeholders, not only in the arts institutions, but in the premise that we are all creative beings and that we need to develop that part of ourselves if we will be whole and our communities will be whole. So the limited understanding and movement along that continuum, moving the needle, I think is a really important imperative and challenge that lies ahead. I think related to that, and this is something that I'm learning more and more about as I delve into questions like, how is art and culture present in health literature or in education literature or in environmental policy areas? When you look at that and you think about how people create their ideas of how the world works, and by extension, what theories of change in communities look like, what I've found is that because the mention of arts and culture is either non-existent or limited, the concept of both what the situation that they want to address is and the plausible strategies designed to address those situations are not going to include arts and culture because it's not part of the realm. It's getting back to the not on the radar idea, right? So in the education field, even though there are important strides in these place-based initiatives where there's recognition that context and place is important if we want to understand how children and families thrive, if you look at the literature, there isn't a lot of literature about the arts beyond its presence in classroom settings or after-school opportunities. So more expansive thinking about design or about the role of artists in other capacities in relation to both adults and children isn't part of what they're looking to serve as the basis for how they construct these theories of change. So that it's an important observation as we think about how might this orientation take hold in a serious way and be sustainable over time. Another issue is that there's no policy consensus about art and what is desirable or what is unacceptable. And what I mean by that is that in other fields, say in housing, there's clarity about what decent, affordable housing is supposed to look like and perhaps how much of it should exist for certain levels of population. Even in the idea of park space and green space, there's some consensus about what's desirable in terms of open space in communities. Or environmental issues, what would be intolerable in terms of levels of pollutants or what's desirable in terms of clean air. With the arts, with few exceptions, and one being arts education, there really isn't very much. There's no edict that says it is unacceptable to not have a neighborhood art center, and I'm making that up. Or there is no edict that says it is desirable that there should be X number of working artists per 1,000 population. There is nothing like that that helps solidify the value and presence of the arts as part of how we think about livable places and places that we would aspire to create. Another challenge is the focus on economic impacts and causality, which I think is important but problematic. So much of the work around impacts has been around the economic impacts of the arts, and that's the currency of the debate, the policy debate, and that's understandable. And I think the arts field, in some ways that one can understand, has taken that and run with it. But I think it's also been at the exclusion of looking at other kinds of impacts that are really important, whether they be intrinsic benefits of the arts, as well as health impacts or impacts that have to do with social cohesion, and other things that are important and often as important as economic indices. Because the focus has been so much on economics, I think we've not cultivated a robust body of research, data, and even arguments or theories about the role of the arts in these other ways. And there's some work, certainly, on social impact of the arts and what have you, but that is still developmental, and it's not a very robust body of work in the way that some other areas are. Another challenge is that engaging in cross-sector systems work is hard, and including the arts makes it even harder. So while I think that there's belief that better solutions will come out of integrated strategies, and if the arts are laid into that, it will be even stronger, getting there is tough. And it's tough for lots of reasons. There is a history of working in silos, so people work not across policy areas synergistically, but often in isolated ways that don't lead to as robust results as potentially could be possible. There's jargon that gets in the way. Standards of excellence and criteria for success have been created in silos. So when you get activity that is intended to be synergistic and intentionally cross-silo, we haven't caught up in thinking about what does excellence look like in that context and what does success look like in that context. The skill set required to work across silos is different from what people typically bring in more isolated spaces. And we need people who can connect and translate, and there aren't enough of those out there. Another point has to do with artists and the role of artists as leaders, where in many instances, you don't see artists in leadership positions in these strategies around community revitalization. Often they're not part of the conceptualization process, and inclusion, if there is inclusion, is at the end. They're content providers. Sometimes they decorate. They become beacons for audiences. And those three roles are, again, not to be dismissed as unimportant, but there are so many more robust ways in which artists can contribute with their intellectual and creative might on the conceptual level in even figuring out how to frame the issue and thinking outside the box and pushing the envelope on what strategies and solutions might look like. So these are all issues that I think we have to wrestle with. And the last one is the training and professional development opportunities to do this kind of work are scarce. And that's true in terms of artists who are involved with this work and people who are not artists, but from other sectors or arts administrators. As I said before, the skill set is a different one. It requires a different way of thinking about the world and acting in it. And the ways in which people can develop the skills to do that are still not very robust. So going back to the question that I posed earlier, given some of these realities, if we think 10, 15, 20 years forward, and we know that part of the challenge now is to create the environment in which this kind of work can thrive in a sustainable way, where it can take hold. And it's no longer new, but it's part of how we do business. What's required? What's different? And as we start this conversation, because I'm going to stop talking really soon, as we start this conversation, I want to ask in your own locales, whether you're working in a city or a town or a neighborhood, or even if you're working at the federal level, what would be different 10, 15, 20 years from now if we're successful? So I'm going to stop there and open it up for discussion.
Hi, I'm Jack Becker with Forecast Public Art and Public Art Review magazine out of the Twin Cities. And we've had a grant program for the last 24 years that gives funding to artists throughout the state of Minnesota, both for research and development as well as public projects. So asking artists to work out in the communities and ask them what they want to do with their creativity to make a difference in the world, and then giving them funding. Not a lot of money, but something that is responding to what they want to do with audiences they want to serve, with messages they want to send. And then giving them technical assistance and training and documentation and promotion and sort of being their back house organization to help them go do that has proven very effective in Minnesota for helping incubate a community of artists who can recognize that they actually have a lot of things to offer their communities that they maybe didn't learn about in school. And so this is just a very simple model, and it's a re-granting program. So foundations that can't support individuals directly, they can go through a nonprofit organization to re-grant money out to individuals. In this case, it's Jerome and it's emerging artists that they particularly care about. But I've always thought this is a very simple model, very low overhead, low maintenance kind of program that could be done in other communities. And it basically becomes this incubator. Because once artists realize they can follow their own passion and stick to their core of what they want to do and what they believe in, and that there's somebody that's supporting them with the direction they want to go with their creativity, it totally changes the paradigm upside down, and they become much more independent and independent producers. And then communities start to see artists working in the communities. It starts to change their views of who artists are and what they can contribute. And so I could imagine something like this happening in every state and making a big difference in the long run.
Great. Thank you for sharing that example.
Colin Hamilton with
Colin.
ArtSpace. I really appreciate the way you frame this and the notion that there is a moment that we're in that is exciting and full of opportunity, but to really use it, we need to be thinking about 10, 15 years down the line and what do we want out of it. In terms of a vision of where we would be more successful, it seems to us that one of the things we're struck by is how many communities out there are asking this basic question of how they can use their artists and arts better to build a healthy community. Some version of that question is all around us. What it feels like is not being asked as often and needs to be, because it really is how that question becomes a sustainable one, is what conditions a community needs to create so that its artists can thrive. And it's the difference between thinking about the artists or the arts really as a vehicle for change versus thinking of your artist as an asset that you need to cultivate and make available for the future. And when we think about, where does this go and what really makes it sustainable, it's when those communities are not thinking just about how they can use their artists, but how they can really create conditions where the artists are going to endure and thrive and replicate.
Thank you.
Gulgun came from the city of Minneapolis. I actually want to piggyback on both of those conversations because there's the issues of conditions, setting the right conditions to engage with artists in the city is one that I've been working with for the last couple of years. And actually my outcome in the next, hopefully it's sooner than 15 years, is actually to make artists less independent and more integrated into what we do as a daily aspect of life, so that we don't see them as a rarefied exception, but one of the many things that we call on to make our communities better. So I'm actually hopeful that artists will then have more income streams and not be so reliant on grant funding as one of their main income streams. They have other ways of defining what success looks like other than putting their work inside of museums. They have more freedom to determine their own future and more scope to do that rather than the industry of art telling them what that looks like. So for me, that's an outcome that would be what I'd like to see in an integrated system.
So it sounds also like new jobs and validation systems as part of it, yeah.
What would it look like 20 years from now if we'd moved way down that spectrum? What a great question. Art and science would converge, would be reintegrated. The tech entrepreneurs and the arts entrepreneurs would be one community who would learn from each other. Artists would accept that failure is experience, churn is good, organizations don't have to last forever, and tech entrepreneurs would learn the sort of nonlinear thinking, totally tapping into pattern recognition skills that artists do so well. That's the future that I think we need to create. Oh, one other thing. We would have a 21st century arts and crafts movement that brings the thinking of artists into the making of everyday objects. The first arts and crafts movement started here in Providence with the Rhode Island School of Design because the wives of the mill owners were disgusted by the crap their husbands were making. And I think there's general acceptance that we're buying too much badly made crap from China. We can make better stuff here, maybe less of it, and we can recreate the middle wage jobs that are the obstacle to upward mobility.
Hello. Oh, okay. My name's Erica. I work for Friends of the Highline. And when you asked that question, one of the reasons that I'm here is that arts is not something that I grew up being comfortable in. And I think I'm slowly getting a little more comfortable. And as I think about one of the programs that we just did, working with teens and taking them to art institutions so that they, and these are teens that particularly live in the two housing developments across the street from the High Line. And one of the ideas was that, as a teenager, the spaces that you get to be in as a teenager kind of give you some ownership down the line. And, as has been mentioned with the Met and admission prices and the language that's used and how intimidating that can be, I know growing up in New York, I didn't go to a museum unless it was as a school trip, and I don't think I've done too many other visits on my own for that same reason. And even though I can go in and I can read it and I'm educated and I know that I don't have to pay, it can still feel very intimidating. And when we were talking about that class division in arts, I think that's any opportunity I had it through schooling. And so I think definitely figuring out how to make sure that there's expression, that there's intrinsic value in arts and what's created in schools, because often, or at least in my experience coming from, being first generation, anything that had value came out of education, and that's all my mom focused on, and my dad, in that was important. So any opportunities I could get from there, those were my only real opportunities to do for myself. And so many grow up like that, right? Because if their parents don't know better, don't have kind of the access or understanding of how certain systems work, that's where they're learning from, and that's where they're going for their support, and that's where they're going for their leadership. That's the examples that they get. So I think, mentioning that there not enough leadership within arts or artists being seen as leaders, I think that it's definitely about taking the opportunity to figure out how do we express that value. And, we've talked about, the language that we use for measurement, and seeing this as an opportunity to say, the language that we're using isn't good enough. Let's just, we're here talking about it because it clearly matters. And I think if as we're talking about evaluating projects and what we're working on, we say this is what needs to matter, and we repeat that over and over again, at some point that's got to be enough to change it. So it's not just about conforming to what's already there, but continuing to challenge. This is what's important. I've been to so many things where we talk about interdisciplinary, synergistic, and we're saying, we don't follow this, we don't. Well, if we know that, right, let's just stop saying it's not working. So I think it's about, because it's in everything that I've done, like environmental policy, things are synergistics, it's ecosystems, so why are we going linear thinking? So we're all intuitively aware of this, and I think it's just making sure that we are demanding it as opposed to asking for it. Sometimes it's not about asking permission to be heard. I think it's thinking about art in that very same way when we're thinking about policy and politics, and so I think it's changing that language to take more of a stand, and then also figuring out how to see that there's value that in our education system.
So I think it's a really good point. I think that's a really good point, and hand in hand, though, goes the idea of modifying the systems or creating new systems to support that value. So I think what we've got now maybe is the needle moving on the value issue, the needle trying to move a bit on the systems issue. And one of the questions that I often ask as someone who thinks about this is a lot is, what are the systems that are most amenable to really being examples of how the arts can be integrated? And is that at the local level? Is that at a federal level? What does it take? Who has to be involved? How long does it take? And what does success look like if we think of that not happening in one fell swoop, but incrementally over time? And I see lots of hands, so great.
Those are all great questions. One of the likely challenges, very likely challenges we're going to face in the next 20 years is fewer artists. To the extent that the Academy turns out artists, art historians, arts administrators, we've seen a precipitous decline in our enrollments in our classes and in our schools since 2008. Now, that seems to be a no-brainer. We've been having economic problems since 2008, but this is the longest and the steepest decline in enrollments we've seen. Moreover, there's usually one would expect to see, as other sectors have seen, that line is starting to go up again. It has not. And when that starts to happen, since, forgive me if there are any academic administrators here, but they bean count. What happens is that after a couple of years of low enrollments, you lose a tenure line, you lose that course, and as a consequence, there's likely to be a brain drain or a hand drain. The good news, of course, is that there'll be less competition for limited funds, but that is really making lemonade out of lemons. So we have to convince our kids that it's okay to be artists.
My name is Eric Takashi. I work with the Local Initiative Support Corporation, which is actually a group that works across the country supporting community development. And I do a lot of work in Minneapolis and St. Paul around how creative placemaking and how artists can be involved in this. To that last point, I think part of the challenge and part of your question, Maria, about what do we need to do in 10 years is we need to stop having this conversation, right? We need to actually create a broader definition of artists. Who is an artist? I think we also need to think about broader definitions of and really reconciling the difference between arts and culture, and not define artists solely by the fine arts or solely in the Western canon, but start thinking more broadly about who gets to be included in that conversation. Anne actually kicked us off talking about a bigger tent, and I think that we have to create a bigger tent if we're going to get to where we're talking about, Maria.
I think that's exactly right. And in thinking about pipeline, which you brought up with artists, I think about that as well. But I also think about pipeline with urban planners, with community development professionals, with people in the health field. And when is that? It's as if there's a two-tiered imperative. And one is to develop the manpower that can move this now. That can seize the moment and move this now. And there's another longer term view that is about where is it that the next generation of people who will potentially do this work or even better versions of it, where are they coming from, and how can we develop the systems where the kind of thinking that you're talking about, Eric, is exactly what already comes in the DNA.
I'm Lori Baevsky. I'm here representing the Virginia Arts Festival. And I would like to continue this thread of higher education and how we're training our artists and what we're doing right and what we're doing miserably wrong. I was involved for many years with ArtsBridge America, which is a teaching artist training program that links universities into the community. And what we're seeing is that, going back to the silos, we're continuing, higher education is not keeping up with the conversation we're having in this room. And I think it is silo-based. And we see, yet another generation of emerging artists that are not getting the tools they need to survive in an entrepreneurial artist's world. And the professors are against it. It's a real pushback from higher education to transform the model, and yet we're continuing with this conservatory model of training our artists. And so they get out into the world, and they're charged with all of these tasks that we've discussed today without the necessary tools. And so I think something has to shift within higher ed so that we are the incubator, we're the resources, and some universities are leading that charge, and it's not coming fast enough.
Hi, my name is Renee Eisenbach. I'm actually a faculty member in architecture at University of Maryland, and my work crosses art and architecture. And actually, I think it's a little more hopeful than what you are saying. Actually, tomorrow or Monday, there's a deadline in our university for new courses on design thinking, innovation, and entrepreneurship in the undergraduate core curriculum. And that we are finding, based on some of the inspiration from the D School, from the work of firms like Frog and IDEO, we're finding that universities are also looking at how to respond to the effort of MOOCs and sort of make the arguments for face-to-face work and cross-disciplinary work and working in our locations. So we will now be undergraduates in our university and other universities will have opportunities to be taking courses that are cross-disciplinary and thinking in that way in design problem solving. Say another wonderful example is at Portland State University in Eugene, which has started the Sustainable Cities program, and that's been emulated at different universities also. And in that university, they ask for communities to come up with proposals. They match the university to the communities. The communities identify a whole set of sustainable issues in their communities that range from technical to water to cultural. They pair classes to the particular problems, and each year they have about 24 classes that work with those communities on those issues. I'd say that model is being emulated. We're looking to emulate it as well.
That's
so
terrific.
I think that it's not just about arts education. I think we can find examples in higher education in which we are trying to re-educate and rethink the way that people are being taught who are going to go into all these different fields in policy, in business, in whatever. So thank you.
Great.
I think that's a really positive future.
Hi, I'm Ann Woolsey from the Rhode Island School of Design. I'm actually in the museum, so I'm not exactly the best person to talk about this, but I'm the only person from RISD here today. And starting with Kip's comment, I think about technology and arts integration in terms of entrepreneurship, I just wanted to mention that there is a bill in front of Congress that has been introduced by our president, John Maida, that encourages the STEM movement, science, technology, engineering, and math, to be turned into the STEAM movement that includes arts and design for education at all levels. So while the Rhode Island School of Design has been working in the community for many, many years across every discipline, we're now advocating that education be focused on arts and design from the outset, so from elementary school onward. And I would ask you to support the bill. I would ask you to get in touch with your congressman and make sure that they're aware of this initiative. Thanks.
So lots of energy around education issues, and the STEM to STEAM work, I think, is a really important piece. What are some other systems, though, as we think about things that need to be different?
My name is Cheryl Russell. I'm with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So glad to be here with RISD and Pratt Institute as well. And I do want to, I think, echo the higher ed positive message. You know, our president is Dr. Walter Massey, who's actually a physicist, who's head of our school. You know, he used to be president of Morehouse, and I think it's been very interesting the concrete ways that he has found to really marry art and science. First of all, by this discussion of the similarities in terms of temperament and character of the artist and the scientist. Right? Not afraid to take risks, not afraid to fail, open to criticism and experimentation. I think that the other thing that the school has been very good in doing is making this marriage, once again, kind of building on Kip's point about this marriage of art design with technology. You know, SAIC was actually approached by Northwestern University's engineering school because what they were finding was that their engineering graduates were missing that design element. So this was an external, right? Another institution of higher education sort of seeing that missing component and what was needed. So I do think that there's a lot of hope in the higher ed system kind of being the place to train the next generation of artists and designers on how to be interdisciplinary. So I'm hopeful. I'm excited.
It's exciting that there is this traction and interest, and it's certainly a huge piece of the puzzle. There are other pieces.
I was just going to say something that one thing I right here, sorry. My name's Catherine Housley, and I don't represent an organization. I'm an artist. And one thing I haven't mentioned, we keep talking about how higher education is going to do stuff for people and how we're going to merge with science. One block that so many artists run up across is that An extraordinary number of us have not had education, specifically. We don't have a degree. We don't have that type of credential. So over and over again, we run up against this block where we are evaluated with a system that looks at your degrees first. Like, for instance, I could not go over to Taiwan, for instance, and get a teaching job, even though I've had 4 books published, and I probably know more than anybody who's just come out of school as far as children's book publishing, but I don't have the type of degree that they require. So I would like to know how you're going to accommodate this huge number of artists that are not accredited, like probably most of the people in this room are.
It's a very good question. It's an equity issue also that we run up against. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Aaron Jungles from Everett Company Stage and School here locally. We are actually dealing with this issue with some of the people that we serve. We serve mainly a low-income population with free programming in the performing arts. And what we were finding is that a lot of our artists, once they reached the age where they would go to college if they had that opportunity, didn't have that opportunity or weren't prepared for it. And also, because of the realities of their lives, couldn't remain in the arts because they had to get jobs or that took them away from that creative expression. So we started a program called Barnstormers where we brought 5 young artists into our office to work on the business side and learn that and to gain those skills. And also, it's expanding our diversity, expanding our capacity, and it's really been a great kind of grassroots model for us.
Thank you. I really want to hear from people that have had some experience with the cross-sectoral work, because I think that on the ground, where there is an on-the-ground opportunity to try to integrate arts and culture into places that there hasn't been thought about it. What are some of the things that you're learning, and as you project forward, what would you like to see? Who has something to say about it?
I'm Randy Rosenbaum. I'm the director of the State Arts Council here in Rhode Island. And I've been particularly intrigued with the comments that you made about artists as leaders. A lot of the artists that I know are politically aware. They're acting in ways that community organizers might work, and yet none of them are getting involved in the political process. And I tend to think that one of the most productive ways to actually change the environment is for artists to get involved in that political process so that they can be part of the leadership that sets the new direction for our state. And in the 19 years that I've been here, only one person in the General Assembly has identified herself as an artist and wasn't around for very long. So I'm just sort of putting that out there.
Very important point. Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura Zabel from Springboard for the Arts, and I think to your question, Maria, one of the places where we've really seen a lot of opportunity and just a sort of tremendous willingness and openness is from the community development field, and specifically from CDCs and community organizers who I feel like in this sort of serendipitous moment are having a sort of parallel conversation in their world as they kind of come to the realization that the bricks and mortar infrastructure development is not enough for communities, that you also have to figure out how to engage with community, how to have a collective impact, how to think a little more holistically. And so there has been this sort of perfect puzzle piece fit to be able to work with partners like that and say, you know, artists are particularly skilled at helping you think through issues of community engagement or how you animate a space during development. And I was really struck by what you said about the sort of validating environments or sort of metrics for how much a community needs. And I had a really interesting conversation with a woman who's actually a for-profit developer, but a very socially conscious developer, about her desire to develop some parallel certification process to the LEED process for how art and creativity are engaged in development. And I think those
Can you
kind
say
of...
what LEED is in case people
Yes,
don't
it's
know?
an environmental process by which you can sort of achieve different levels of greatness in your development based on how much energy it's using and how you're incorporating other environmentally sustainable building materials. and things like that. And so she was sort of seeing a parallel in some work that we'd been doing with her in placing artists in her development process around community engagement, around culture, and sort of community ownership of a space. And so I think you're exactly right. I think we need to explore where are there sort of parallel mechanisms or those kind of external systems that will allow us to take it one step beyond the very relationship-based way of working. So right now it works really well when you meet a developer like that and we love each other and work really well together. But then how do you transfer that to a sort of system-wide impact?
Thank you for that. Where's the mic?
Yeah, hi. My name is Max McCarthy. I run a small Main Streets program in Boston. We were an Art Place grantee. Wanted to echo a couple of the points around broadening the tent, thinking about arts in other sectors. 2 points I wanted to make. One was, we were part of an initiative looking at kind of cross-sector infusing arts and community revitalization, supporting businesses. My work is mainly supporting local businesses and supporting local business districts. And one of the big things, paradigm shifts for me, was thinking about artists as businesses. So I traditionally thought about businesses as having a brick and mortar store on a main street, but there's a lot of artists, in particular, there's a lot of businesses that are at home, and oftentimes they're in the arts and culture sphere, folks who make jewelry, soaps, photography, all sorts of things that are traditionally not the same way we think about arts. So that was a big thing for me, and then related to that point, thinking about I mentioned this yesterday, but the arts lowercase a, not arts capital A, and how it's connected to kind of the identity of a place. So, we have a restaurant at Cape Verde. We have a large Cape Verdean population, and who I think, we have a restaurateur who's, has a culinary art that you don't think about as an artist, but is so much about what makes a place the way it is. But we don't think of them as artists. And I think that's just important to keep in mind when we're thinking about expanding this tent for someone like
certainly
me.
broadening the tent to include the things that are part of everyday lived experience, even.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Responder, I teach at Rutgers online as well as Baruch, and my view is that a lot of the artists are going into data science and other kinds of things because there's more money in it, and also because they're basically pattern recognition is good in both, and so a lot of the people that I have in my classes online are ones that can go both ways. So but I also have a lot of people that want to figure out how to use social media to kind of like promote themselves, and that's the main reason for the course I created at Rutgers, and it's been very successful in that regard, mostly in just kind of letting them know what's out there, so that they can make their own decision. My feeling though is that. All those things you mentioned, MOOCs and so on, that's all happening, and that's going to, there might not be less artists, but the way art is defined might change, and I think that's a good thing.
So 2 data points. Olin College, outside of Massachusetts, first engineering school in the country, started from nothing, has art, culture, and design courses required by engineers. So there's already a movement between those two elements happening. Second data point. The maker manufacturing conversation is happening here beginning on December 5th at Bryant College. A conversation between makers and manufacturers.
Excellent.
So I got 2 more points. So one of the things that's important is to realize we just finished a century and we're in a new order. And the mythologists tell us emphatically the stories, form, and rituals that defined the old century go away. We need new forms, new stories, and new rituals to build the next century. A lot of what I heard in the last day and a half, we're still holding on. We gotta let go, build the future. Last point. This whole idea of what is art for. So, James Hillman, who Barnaby mentioned yesterday, one of my teachers, has this really interesting sort of framework I want to just share with you. 3 realms of experience, 3 realms of understanding. The concrete, the psychological, and the mythological. In the concrete realm, facts rule. In the psychological realm, it's conversation, it's bonding, it's relationships. Emotion shows up. And then that final realm, mythology. Invisible, unexplainable. Stories, poem, and images. If we start evaluating all of that with this, we're dead in the water. Use the facts to make the case, but get away quick. Get to these other two realms.
Thank you for that. And then your last comment.
Yeah, I'll just give a quick example, and I'm not sure if one of the stakeholders I work with, but I facilitated a group in Newport. It was an arts and cultural group, and it was around collaboration, whether they could collaborate to do something really big. And at the end of the facilitation, what they found out is they actually have something bigger to offer across sector. So what they did is they created a platform for dialogue that they're in the initial stages of, which was kind of a card catalog. Because you look at the museum and the way it is set up right now is kind of dead. And they're trying to figure out how to bring the museum out and make it more accessible. So they created these cards that they put into a catalog that has a series of different events over history. And they're coming from the colonial age, which was a fascinating age in Newport of freedom. It was a place where democracy began. And so they use it to translate. So they have images of, and I'm going to make Rhode Island look bad, but we have a lot of things in our way. And 38 Studios was one of the uglier ones we had. And the reason why the state keeps on getting in the media as a place where economic things do not happen. So they use that as an example, and they showcase over time in history lessons learned in those kind of cases and what could happen today if you put us at the table. So what they're asking, they're like invitations. They're giving you these cards as an invitation to put the arts and cultural at those cross-sectoral dialogues in every level and saying we have a vital past. It's a data point that's different than the data points we're talking about today. They're stories that can really improve the economic passage of the future. So I think they've created a model, a platform for a dialogue, and they're still working at it, and obviously there's flaws in it and there's things that can be fixed, but it's a wonderful way of using what they do really well in the cataloging of these archives to give to someone to say, this is a data point we need to learn from, and we can actually have a dialogue here.
So thank you. I think there's lots of examples and lots of promising things to build on. Still, it's a moment for both optimism and careful scrutiny of the really important work that has to go forward. So I want to thank you for enduring my comments at the beginning and for having such a robust conversation among you. Thank you.